Hello everyone, welcome back. My name is David Webb, and today we're going to be talking about editing. Be sure to stay tuned because today I'm going to be talking about the one thing that you need to realize that will make editing your book a whole lot easier and a whole lot more fun. So let's jump into it. Today we're going to be talking about editing. Specifically, how to actually enjoy it. Editing is a really scary word in the world of a writer, and you can't necessarily blame us for thinking so. Editing could mean anything from changing a few small things in your book, to changing up a few characters in the order of scenes, to completely revamping your novel, and in some cases, rewriting it entirely. There are ways to set yourself up for success to where you'll have to do as little editing as possible in the back end, but today we're going to be talking about how best to go about editing your book and even how to actually enjoy it. Seems crazy, I know, but I believe that you can and you should enjoy editing your book for one very important reason that I'll go into later in the video, and really the one true thing you need to realize in order to actually enjoy editing your book. Before we get started, be sure to hit the subscribe button down there in case you haven't already. I talk about a lot of different writing topics on this channel, and if you stick around long enough, I promise if this video isn't good enough for you, you'll find one that suits exactly what you're looking for. So that said, let's jump into it. And for this video, we're gonna make a mini glossary real quick just to make sure we're all on the same page and we all know what's going on. Developmental editing. This is more or less figuring out your story. You've got to straighten out the flow of your story, the characters. These are all the big, massive changes that you'll make. Reordering chapters, rewriting chapters, and taking chapters out entirely. Because especially if you write by the seat of your pants, there are very likely going to be major issues in your story. It's more or less inevitable. Line editing. This is a sentence-by-sentence look at your book, making sure that the prose looks good, the syntax looks good, the grammar looks good. Basically an advanced form of spell and grammar check. And when I say advanced, I mean advanced. Do not run your book through words, spelling, and grammar check. It catches a lot, but it misses a whole lot more. And finally, proofreading. This is a very detailed look at your book, preferably after you've all laid it out for print. You're going to go over each and every inch of your book with a fine-toothed comb and catch all those little errors that make it past those other two stages. This requires extreme attention to detail because it is so easy to miss things in your book, especially if you're the one that's written it. Your brain recognizes the sentence structure of your own hand, and it wants to believe that everything you've written is good. It will miss errors time and time again and convince itself that it's seeing perfectly good English. Those are the three general stages of editing. There are a couple more that you can throw in there, but those are just the bare minimum. The first thing that you need to do when you finish your book is put it down. Give yourself a month at least where your book is just sitting in a closet, where your book is just sitting in a dresser, sitting under the bed, where your book is just sitting in a folder on your laptop, completely untouched by you for a month. This will give you a chance to step away from what you're doing and get perspective. Once you finish your book, you are so close to your project, you will not nearly edit it as well as you would if you were a month out. Finishing a book can be really emotional. On one hand, you're so glad it's over because you've worked so hard on it. On the other hand, you've fallen in love with these characters and you don't want the story to end. Or you're in a coma from the caffeine overdose of drinking all those cups of coffee just to write first thing in the morning. Either way, you're not going to be in the best frame of mind once you finished your novel. Trust me when I say you got to step back, work on something else, and then come back to it. When you come back to it later, you'll come back with a fresh look. You'll see things that you wouldn't have seen before, and it's just going to be easier to see your book a little bit more objectively. The next thing you need to do is realize that it has to be done. All writers must edit. There are people who can write very clean first drafts. I'm one of them. But I promise you, no matter how clean you think your draft is, there will be things that need to be fixed. It's inevitable. I have never seen or heard of a perfect first draft. I have a friend who swears that she writes incredibly clean first drafts and she doesn't edit. And sure enough, she got a lot of negative reviews after she published it because it was full of typos. There will always be some level of editing, whether developmental, substantive, line editing, copy editing, proofreading, that needs to be done no matter what you're writing, how you wrote it, how well you wrote it, or whether or not you're an expert at the English language. I like to think that I have a very good grasp on grammar, syntax, spelling, sitting in a closet, sitting in a dresser, sitting under the bed, but I will never not edit my books. I'd be insane not to do it, despite the fact that I write really clean first drafts. And if you really think your first drafts are that clean, Think about what you're doing when you're writing. You're not engaging that logical side of your brain. In order to be truly creative and to write a smooth book of any kind, you've got to shut off your inner editor. A lot of writers are terrible at this, and so was I for the longest time. But even if you've got your inner editor still turned on and you're overanalyzing everything you write, you're still mostly engaging that side of your brain that's more geared toward the creative. And your brain can really only take so much at one time. If you're truly invested in what you're writing, when it comes down to it, your brain will make the decision for you whether to be more logical or more creative. You know it happens. Most of the time, it's subconscious. But if you really think about it, there's been some times when you're writing, when you know in the back of your mind that you're breaking some rule here, some written or unwritten rule about the English language, plot development, character development, and yet you choose to write it anyway. Everybody does it. The good news is that most of the time there is a way to have the best of both worlds. You can have a structurally sound book with good grammar and have a fulfilling story. It's not an either-or situation. But all this to say is that you must realize that editing is something that must be done. And the sooner that you come to the grips that it has to be done, the sooner you'll be ready and willing to do it. The next thing you need to realize is something not so positive. When you edit your book, it's gonna get a little messier before it gets cleaner, especially if you're doing all the proper stages of editing in the right order. If you finish a really clean first draft and then just send it off to a proofreader, you could end up with decent results. I don't recommend this, but it could happen. If you send it off to a line editor and then a proofreader, you'll have a book that's pretty good as far as the English language is concerned, and it'll look more or less polished. That's even better. But if you send it off to a developmental editor, and then a line editor, and then a proofreader, you're gonna have a book that's pretty solid when it comes to the story and the language itself. However, if you just developmentally edit your book, the story will be great, but the language will probably be a mess, even if your first draft was great. Because what happens is when you go through a stage of editing, things get a little messed up. You can developmentally edit your book, but as you change aspects of the story, there's a very good chance you'll wind up with some continuity errors and even some grammar errors. This is my biggest weakness. My first drafts are pretty good, but as soon as I developmentally edit my book, I make the story stronger, but I'm not always the best at noticing the errors that get introduced in this stage of editing. Thankfully, I am diligent and I move on to the next stage of editing, which is line editing. And by the time I get done with that and proofreading, we're back to a nice, clean, polished state. But if you do these steps out of order, or for some reason you don't do all of them, you run the risk of publishing an incomplete book. Finally, how do you enjoy editing? By realizing that you're making your book better. You have to make the connection in your mind that each and every single edit that you make is improving your book. I know it sounds incredibly elementary, so basic, completely obvious, but it is just so easy to get caught up in the hard work of editing. Forget why you're doing what you're doing and lose all your motivation. This is what I do every single time I sit down to edit. And even though I'm cutting out some really great chapters, I know that I'm making my book better. If you don't make this connection, not only will you not enjoy editing, but you may never get it done. You've got to keep this in mind in the hardest moments of editing, and trust me, you'll thank yourself for it. I remember the first time I showed The Light Thief to one of my beta readers who had already read a previous version of the book and loved it, but this was after I edited it, proofread it, made it pretty, and all I said to her was, please read this version of the book. No extra context. And she came back to me and she said she loved how polished it was. It was exactly what I needed to hear, because when I edited this book, I wasn't very good about remembering that I'm making my book better. And it was really hard sometimes. It took me a long time to do. But those words alone were enough to really encourage me and let me know that I was doing it right all along. So trust me, edit your book, don't skip it. Some bonus tips? Listen to different music when you're editing. Different music will engage your mind in different ways. If you find the right combination of music to listen to when you write your book, and then when you edit your book, you'll see some really cool results. Next tip, write your book quickly, like very quickly. This is because when you write on a regular basis and you write a substantial amount of words every day, your brain is going to keep up with the story a whole lot easier. It's going to flow a whole lot better in your mind and on the page. You may make a few more mistakes as far as spelling and grammar goes, but trust me, line editing is so much easier than developmental editing. Next, use a beta reader. Send your book to a trusted friend, someone who is honest enough to give you good feedback, but someone who loves you enough to give it to you in the best way. Beta readers are great for developmental editing, figuring out what works and doesn't work in your story. And don't be afraid to ask your beta reader what doesn't work. It's one of the best questions you can ask. Other common tough questions include, what scene would you not miss if it weren't there? What character did you just not care about? Were there any points in the book when you just didn't feel like reading anymore? Beta readers are so powerful. And finally, next to realizing that you're making your book better, the number one way to enjoy editing is pay someone else to do it. It is so tiring, so exhausting editing your own book, especially if you don't know how. And even if you do know how, as I said before, it's so hard to edit yourself, even if you're a professionally trained editor like I am. Don't freak out, guys. I promise I'm not going to ask you to sign up for some editing course at the end of this video. I love writing my own books, and I'm very committed to that right now. But paying someone else to edit your book will reward you so much in the future if you plan on publishing it. I know it's an investment, and it's not a small one. A good editor is not cheap, and a cheap editor is not good. If you're on a budget, find some beta readers, get them to help you developmentally edit your story, download a free version of Grammarly, get a trial version of Pro Writing Aid, and go through it line by line and make sure it looks good, and then send it off to another beta reader that has a finer attention to detail. I cannot wholeheartedly recommend this cheap method of doing it because you're doing your book a disservice by not properly editing it. But if you're on a budget, there you go. That's the secret to editing your book in the cheapest way possible. But you're not going to enjoy it nearly as much as sending it off to someone else and then getting it back, making changes, and polishing it that way. That's it for today, everyone. I promise I'm going to make another video about editing in the future. It's a subject that's very near and dear to my heart. However, today I just wanted to give you the highlights, the most important things you need to do before you edit your book and while you're editing your book, and a little cheat sheet on how to get started for cheap. A cheat sheet. Cheat. That's it for today, everyone. Thank you again for joining me. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions about writing. Contact me on social media, buy my book, get off YouTube, and get back to writing.